Good morning, everybody. My name is Wyatt Shields. I'm the city manager for the City of Falls Church. Welcome to our Saturday morning town hall meeting on the proposed FY17 budget. It's snowing outside, and that perhaps has drawn down some of our turnout. But we do want to go through the presentation this morning. It's really, at this point, for the benefit of the tape, so people can watch this at home. Through live streaming or on the internet or on our public access channels. I'd like to welcome Mayor Tarter to come forward to make some welcoming remarks, and we then have our chairman of the school board, Mr. Castillo, as well.
Well, thank you all for coming out, or you for coming out. I'd like to first acknowledge some of my city council colleagues, Karen Oliver and Dave Snyder. I've also got Tom Clinton and Bob Young from the EDA here as well. But thank you for coming out. I know the weather's not great today. It's probably one of the first budget town halls considered to be canceled for snow. So it's not great weather. But as Wyatt said, we do want to put this on tape so that people can watch it from their homes or at a later point. It is important to get this information out. I think that's part of what government does, is give information to the public, and we'd like to have input back, whether that's today or whether that's by email or showing up at a public hearing. We are going to have a public hearing on Monday, April 11th, so we invite anyone here or watching on television to come out and speak your mind about the budget, CIP, or frankly anything else of interest. Today, Mr. Shields is also going to speak a little bit about City Hall. As you may know, improvements to City Hall are under consideration, and it's been an evolving process and project over the years. We wanted to make sure everyone has the latest and greatest so that they can make comment if they choose to about this as well. So anyway, I guess I would just say thanks again for coming out, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Mayor Tarter. So our format this morning is to go through a number of slides. I've got more than I probably ought to. It's about 35 slides or so. I'll try to go through them efficiently. And Mr. Castillo, the chairman of the school board, will present information on the school board budget and budget request that's now before the City Council as well. Just one note, all of our budget information can be found on the city's webpage at this link, and we are receiving comments on the budget. The easiest way to do that is just to send them to budget@fallschurchva.gov, and those will all be distributed to the City Council as we go through the process. The Council is scheduled to adopt the budget on April 25th, and the budget that we're talking about goes into effect on July 1st, 2016. So we're kind of on the end stretch in terms of consideration, and this is our second open house town hall meeting on the budget as well. Here's an overview of the city budget. So we have a budget, proposed budget in 2017 of $87,245,000. 46% of those expenditures are for our public school system. And then debt service for the schools is just about $4.3 million. Debt service for general government is just over $2.1 million. And then if you go around the pie chart, we have capital items that are in the budget. Our community development, which is planning and economic development and building permits, is 4% of the budget. Rec and Parks and Library is 6% of our budget. Our human services are 3% of the budget. Public Works, maintenance of all of our streets and infrastructure, is 6% of the budget. And then police and fire comprises 13% of the budget. Our court services and administration take up the rest of the city budget. So those are the big components of the budget that we're talking about. This is a quick summary of the changes to spending in FY17. For the general government, in terms of our operating budget, we're requesting a change of 1.2% or $438,000 over the prior year. Our debt service is based on the projects that were approved last year, $487,000 increase. The school board has adopted a budget with a requested transfer amount of $40.4 million. That's a $2 million increase or 5.4% increase from the prior year. One of the big features of this year's budget is our cost for Metro Rail and Metro Bus. and we are proposing an increase in funding of $627,000 for WMATA, and $417,000 of that is proposed to come from local taxes. And that was a big lift for us this year, and a big driver for our budget consideration. This is where the money comes from. Again, $87.2 million budget. The majority of it comes from real estate. That's what all local governments in Virginia rely primarily on. In Falls Church, 29% of our real estate revenues come from the commercial sector, including apartments and commercial properties. Going around the horn, those are the other major components. But as you can see from this, just about 50% of our funding comes directly from the business sector of our community. About 1/3 of our funding comes from residential real estate, and then the last 20% or so comes from charges for service, state and federal funds, and other revenues. On assessed values, overall, our assessed value for real estate is growing by 3.8%. The lion's share of that, 80% of our assessed value growth this year, is coming from new construction. 20% is coming from market appreciation. And so the lion's share of that is from the big projects that you see going up in the city. But we also have a lot of construction activity happening out in our neighborhoods. So that 1.7% growth in assessed value for single-family houses is entirely new construction. If you did not put on an addition or do improvements to your house, there was no increase to your assessed value this year. The major projects in of themselves over the past 2 years have contributed $160 or $175 million of new assessed value to the city. What that comes to is about 4.5% of the entire city's assessed value of $3.9 billion is now on those 6 acres where that activity is happening. And those 3 projects alone would be the equivalent of 6 cents on the tax rate in terms of the revenues that they're generating. So the private investment is a significant positive in our budget. It also shows up, the economic development activity shows up in our local taxes. I'll just point out sales taxes in particular. We're projecting a 12% growth or $500,000 of growth, and that's principally due to the new grocery stores that are coming online with the new development. Business licenses also a healthy increase because of that commercial activity. Overall, 7% increase in local taxes related to business activity. So a quick summary of the budget then. What the economy is giving us is a 4.3% growth in revenues. The general government request is a 1.2% growth. The school board request is a 5.4% growth. Debt service is an 11% increase, and then this WMATA requirement that I mentioned earlier. So all in all, we have a $1.1 million gap in the budget. And so in the budget that's before the City Council, there are the following increases in rates to close that gap. An increase of 2.5 cents for the school system. The personal property tax rate would be a 16-cent increase or a 3.3% increase, and that would be entirely for transportation. And the cigarette tax, an 85-cent per pack increase, also the revenue from that would be dedicated entirely for transportation projects, this WMATA cost that I described earlier. With those changes in terms of a real estate tax rate, that would move us to $1.34. We do remain in the middle of the pack for the Northern Virginia jurisdictions, particularly the smaller jurisdictions. Vienna and Herndon and all the towns have rates that are higher than us, very similar to Leesburg, and then the larger counties in particular with lower rates. This is a chart that we've just developed in the last year that draws a correlation between population and tax rate. And on this chart, this yellow dot is the city of Falls Church with the tax rate that is a little bit below average for the smaller jurisdictions, or you could say sort of in the middle of the pack for the smaller jurisdictions. For the counties, their tax rates are clustered around that $1.10 to $1.20 rate with a larger population. So there are economies of scale. Also, the counties do not take care of their streets. Those are taken care of directly by VDOT, and there are other differences between cities and counties that drive tax rates. In the counties, however, there are many special tax districts. This is just one example in Tyson's Corner, where if you add in the various different tax service districts that any entity in Tyson's Corner pays, their effective rate is $1.49.1. With the 2.5 cent increase in the real estate tax rate, that would cause an increase for the median home in the city of $163, or about a 2% increase in the average home in the city. For the personal property tax rate, the increase in the rate from the current $4.84 to $5 would result in a $27 increase for the median car in the city. Now, a decent chunk of the personal property tax rate is for business tangible as well. It's not just purely a car tax. So all in, this would generate an additional $170,000, again, entirely for transportation. The budget on the general government side has no new positions. We provide sustained funding in the budget for positions that were approved last year on a temporary basis, but there are no new positions. So our staffing level is at 199, which is the same as last year. Our employee compensation, the budget has built into it a 3.0% increase in compensation for employees. That is a merit increase that would occur after performance evaluation is complete. There's no COLA associated with that, so it's really just a straight 3% increase with no additional compensation. Health insurance premiums, this has been a late developing item on our budgets. The information came in really the week that I presented the budget to the City Council. For the local choice, it's a 25% increase in premiums, and that's a big hit to the budget and also a big hit to employees who will absorb their share of that premium increase. About 40% on the city government side of our employees are enrolled in Kaiser, and that's a 5% increase, more affordable. In the budget, we do have a number of items, capital renewal that are debt financed, and those include police vehicles and a backhoe and some core IT equipment and items like that. So those are not built into the tax rate. Those are proposed to be debt financed, and the debt service would come in. We would delay those purchases to the end of the fiscal year, and that debt service will come in FY18, next fiscal year. Some items that we know we're going to have to deal with in the future include additional police officers for the city. That comes with population growth, and but other items that we know are coming, the voting machines. That's a state mandate that we'll have to comply with. That's $200,000 that will need to be in the FY18 budget, and other items here that are listed. We'll talk about the capital program. And we do have really the capital improvement program is where I think a lot of the attention and a lot of the work is as we go through this year's budget. We have very significant projects in the CIP. Most notably, the George Mason High School and Mary Ellen Henderson Middle School expansion that are in the CIP for $105 million. Big Chimneys Park is a project that's funded through the proceeds from the sale of the Podolnik property. We also have other park improvements that are built into the budget, Fire Station 6 improvements. There are really only 2 new projects in the FY17 budget. Everything else is simply projects that were allocated in last year's CIP, and now are in that year where they come online. But the 2 projects would include the Economic Development Authority has offered the city a $550,000 grant to improve and construct a new the downtown plaza. And the school board has requested $4 million for land acquisition funds. Both of those are in the budget. We also have over $7.2 million of transportation projects, all funded with outside NVTA or other grants in the city. Significant area of activity. So all in all, if you break it out by a pie chart, the $109 million in the 5-year CIP for schools, $24.6 million for transportation improvements, $13 million of projects for public facilities, and public safety, 0.9% of the CIP, or $1.4 million, and recreation and parks or investment in our parks, 3.9, about $4 million in the 5-year CIP. This is the amount of debt that we have outstanding today. We have $55 million of debt that we're currently paying debt service on. About 75% of that is for school facilities, and 25% of that is for city facilities. If you look ahead in the CIP, this is what the projected increases in debt service will be in the out years. So starting in 2016, we're currently paying just under $6 million a year in debt. That will increase to over $6 million in 2017. If you add the City Hall project, other miscellaneous projects, and then at the top, the green, which is the library project, our debt service for the basic components of the CIP will exceed $8 million by the year 2021. If you add in the school, Mary Ellen Henderson and George Mason High School, that is a significant, about a $6 million increase in our debt service alone for that project. And that really is the driver behind our exploration of a public-private partnership, an attempt to reduce the costs of that debt service. We believe it's feasible, or within our current projections, that debt service could be reduced by half or 2/3 through a public-private partnership, and we're working through the steps that we need to take to do that. The City Council and the School Board will be considering the second phase of that procurement, the Phase 2 RFP for the high school and middle school on Monday and Tuesday next week. I want to, as the mayor indicated, I want to provide more information about the City Hall project. This is a project that has been in the CIP for many years, and in fact, there is no funding in the FY17 CIP for the City Hall project. It's all been appropriated in prior years. But the council is taking steps on, or will consider steps on Monday night to really get this project underway. And the most important step, which would be to hire an architect to begin the planning for it. But there are really three big components to this project, and that is security and public safety improvements for police, sheriff, and court operations, improving the safety of the public for this building in terms of how things happen on court day, but also this building, if you come here on any night of the week, is full of our citizens meeting on boards and commissions, and we want to improve the way that works and overall improve building security and access. So the key goals, courtroom, this building, the way it operates, when we have court, we bring prisoners up from the basement for arraignments, and they come up through the public lobby, through the public elevator, and then come through the courtroom to the front for their arraignment. When you have gang members or when you have victims of crime interacting with the alleged perpetrators right in that closed space, coming right through the lobby, it is, we have been put on notice that is not an acceptable way to run courthouse operations. What prisoners need to be able to do is come in through a segregated entrance, come into the room this way, and not have that interaction or interface with the public as they enter into the space. We also have juvenile and domestic relations court here. Those are very emotional cases with oftentimes very powerful family issues involved. And again, you need to have ways to keep the parties apart from each other and maintain a safe court experience for JD&R as well. So that's really the principal driver of the project is court operations. And the CIP 10 years ago was a separate standalone police station. We have costed that out. It's too expensive, and so what we were proposing is to improve our police department operations, but keep them here in this building. We believe it's the most cost-effective way to go forward. So improved 911 dispatch, a secure garage and sally port for the police. Those are key benefits for the project. We will increase public parking as part of the project. We'll create a central entrance point in the front of the building with all of our more public desks like commissioner, treasurer, building permits, more centered towards the front of the building for easier access, and move our meeting spaces to the front of the building. Those are sort of the key things that we're trying to accomplish with this project. So council has appropriated over the past several years $17.4 million for this project. Of that, it was appropriated in various different years, including the last appropriation last year, which was for $5.25 million for public parking, HVAC, and the rear addition pieces to the project. We have issued debt for this project. There's currently $5.6 million of debt outstanding for the City Hall project. We do anticipate as we move forward that the remaining bonds of $11.3 million would be issued in FY18 and FY19 as we move forward. That additional debt would have an associated $820,000 of debt service as shown on the chart earlier. So the decision for the council on Monday night will be moving forward with architectural and engineering work for this project. It has the contract in total to get us all the way through completion of the project for A&E services is $1.2 million. The first step in that is to develop the schematic designs, and that is anticipated to be $225,000. Every one of these phases can be stopped if there's a decision not to move forward. So the really key public engagement, now we've had a City Hall task force that's worked this project through for the past 3 years. It has members of the community, members of boards and commissions, and city staff, stakeholders on it. But the real, I think, deep engagement with the public will occur with an architect under contract, leading through stakeholder interviews, getting input on the design of these improvements, and that work would really be getting underway in the summer with decisions in the fall. So that's the basic schedule. If all goes according to plan, this is a project that would be under construction in winter of 2018, so two years from now. So again, a summary of the budget, organic revenue growth of 4.3%, operating budget requests for general government of 1.2%, school board requests of 5.4%, increases in debt service and the WMATA requirement. And so that generates a need for additional revenue of $1.1 million. And so to meet that, we have a proposed real estate tax rate of $1.34 and an increase in the personal property tax rate of to $5 and an increase in the cigarette tax rate up to 85 cents per pack. So the council will be having additional public hearings on Monday night, and then the final public hearing on April 25th. Our final work session is on April 18th, which is really kind of the markup session to the budget, and the budget would go into effect on July 1st. So those are the information I had for presentation today, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Castillo for information on the school budget, and then we'll have questions and answers.
Thank you, Mr. Shields. Welcome, everyone. Seems that discretion is the better part of valor for many, so I applaud your good sense in staying home today. I will just present a short overview of our proposed budget for fiscal year 17. And there are three budget drivers. Enrollment growth is the first. One of the things to keep in mind is that last year we had a loss of 9 positions. And the way staffing works, oftentimes there's a bit of a stair step. If you have a class that has 18 students, it has capacity to take additional numbers of students up to a certain threshold, and then you have to add an additional teacher. The enrollment growth here has resulted in that. There are also a couple of staff positions, I think 4, that are being requested for special education needs. There's a 2% average staff wage increase. That's a combination of bonuses and salary increases, as well as closing the salary gap as compared to Arlington. And that is the goal of that project, and we're in the 3rd year of that 4-year program, is to bring us within 3 to 5 years of comparable jurisdiction, which we use as Arlington for our benchmark. And then finally, there are mandates, fixed costs, things such as certain inflation in various rates. We've also seen some healthcare increases that, as Mr. Shields commented, have come at the 11th hour and are creating some challenges for us. And so those are basically the 3 drivers. So our budget, to get into specifics for fiscal year 17, there's the 2% salary increase, of which about $650,000, and that's on average. The pay gap project to bring teachers within 3 to 5% of Arlington takes up about $665,000 of that. The 9 positions I mentioned, the 4 special education and then 5 additional positions, is $856,000. We're also seeing increases in special education tuition. There are some special education students whose needs cannot be met by the division, and so those students attend other institutions and get services elsewhere. We're seeing an increase of $245,000 for their tuition. And then the Arlington Career Center and the Governor's Schools are seeking increases of about $94,400. And then the final issue that I mentioned was the insurance rate increase of $245,000, which has also created challenges that we're still seeking to address. And that translates into almost 5.4% increase, or about $2 million. On the fiscal year 17 recommended operating budget, there's a combination. I think it might be an interesting discussion a little bit, Mr. Shields, to have a discussion over the 1.2% general government budget increase and how WMATA fits in there. And is our budget divided into general government, schools, and then the catch-alls? Because if you look at the overall increase there, you're seeing about a 5% overall increase in our operating budget for the schools. And if you look at the inputs that come into our budget, one of the things, and I'll talk about this a little later, is that we are largely self-funded. And so we have to basically bear about 82% of our costs of education. That's because of certain state funding formulas that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. But ultimately, as compared to many other jurisdictions in Virginia, we bear a lot more of our costs of education, even as we send surpluses to Richmond. The state component is only 6.7% increase there. It's about $6.3 million. We receive hardly any federal money, about $514,000. Other is grants, certain other programs, and then we have a carry forward from last year's budget unexpended funds. And so all that translates into about a 5% operating budget increase. Enrollment is one of the big drivers, and there's another slide that shows how, although the population of Falls Church City is increasing steadily, at a fairly low rate. The population of school-aged children is increasing at a much faster rate. And so this slide shows that we were in 2006, 2007 at about 1,871 students, and now in 2016, 2017, we're looking to have about 2,600 students. This is not an exact science. We've seen some pre-enrollment figures for kindergarten that are a little disquieting because I think the pre-enrollment right now is at 140? 146. Those are very high numbers for this time of year. What the ultimate number is, I'm not going to hazard a guess, but this could be one of the larger kindergarten classes that we'll be seeing this year. As you see, there's been a steady increase. I think on average, it works out to about 3%. Over the last couple of years, that rate has been a little bit lower. But again, one of the interesting things that I think we'll also be seeing is we are now coming out of the Great Recession. We're 5-6 years out of that, 2008, 2009. Interestingly, there was a pretty noticeable drop in the birth rate. As we move out of those difficult economic times, I think you may see birth rates increase and enrollment again accelerate. But that's why we have Weldon Cooper, and that's why we have Mr. Kimball's projections. And they keep tight tabs on how the trends are moving. They do a very good job given all the variables, and we'll continue to watch that. This was the slide that I mentioned earlier, the natural growth trend. Population of Falls Church City has increased 23, almost 24% since 2005, but the Falls Church City Public School enrollment has increased by 47.5% in that same time. So again, one of the anecdotal ways to explain what's happened is many people moved onto streets several years ago where there weren't many children on the block, and now pretty much every house on the block has children. So that's an interesting trend. Again, I think it's going to continue at some rates, which we estimate to be in the 3% and change, and we'll keep tabs on that. This slide reflects what I was just talking about. The percent of total population enrolled in public schools. Falls Church is about 17%. Fairfax, it's 16%. Arlington is just under 10%. And Alexandria is 8.7%. What that means is that Alexandria has many more households with no children or fewer children than Falls Church, which has about twice the number of children to support for the population. Arlington is at about 10%. In some respects, that's good for Arlington. In other respects, it probably is a cause for concern because I think that number is going to increase over time, which means that they'll lose that cushion that they have. But the bottom line here is that we have a lot of school-aged children in Falls Church relative to our population for our region. Historic per pupil spending. The city transfer for students is shown here on this slide going back to fiscal year 07. These are in nominal dollars. They don't reflect the bite that inflation takes over time. But you can see from this slide that there has been some pretty substantial variation in these numbers. The slide starts out with fiscal year 07, starts at $14.3 thousand per student, peaks at $14,880 in fiscal year 09, and then you see the effects of the Great Recession in fiscal years 10 and onwards, where in fiscal year 12, the per pupil spending actually moved down, again in nominal dollars, to $12,500 per student. It's climbed back up since then. Now we're at $15,114 per student for fiscal year 16. And if you take that and adjust it for inflation, you'll see that we're still at historic lower numbers. We now are spending roughly $1,400 less per student in real dollars than we were in fiscal year '07. The number went all the way down to $11,000 per student in fiscal year '12. It has since moved up. I think some of that reflects the fact that there were some substantial cuts and ways to sort of telescope spending. Sorry about that. And now as enrollment pressures have come along, there's less play in the budget, and so the nominal numbers have been going up. But again, they still remain lower than they haven't, the first time that the average transfer per student has grown has been since fiscal year 11. Since fiscal year 10 and below, we're still below in real terms what we were at in those earlier years. Bottom line here is that we are spending relatively less per student than we have in the past. A decade of change. For 2007 to 2017, we've seen our operating budget grow. We've got revenue growth of about $12,700,000. Salaries, benefits, and wages, which constitute about 85% of our total budget, because we are ultimately an organization that employs people to teach students. As we have enrollment growth, we have to have growth in teachers and staff, and that has grown by about $12 million. The bottom line being there that with 660 new students in salary and benefit and wage increases, there's a relatively modest amount, about $2/3 $665,000, additional revenue for everything else, which includes all the non-people expenditures, the 15% that doesn't account for salaries and benefits. So I think this slide really establishes that what we've been seeing is budgetary growth has been the product of demographic change and enrollment growth. And I don't ever make a presentation where I don't remind everyone that in Falls Church City, we had 2,500 students back in the mid-60s, I think 1965. So in some respects, we've seen a sort of U-shaped curve with respect to enrollment, and we are, to some respects, going back to the past, picking up where we left off in the mid-60s. And when you think about the tremendous economic growth that we've seen in the area, I think it's understandable that we would see an increase in the school-aged population, and I think the only surprise is that it took us so long to get back to that number. All right, this slide shows the inputs for the revenues that we get. The city transfer, the local funding, which I mentioned before, is 82.7%. State funding is 12.8%. The other includes grants and federal government support, of which we receive very little because most federal government support is for Title I funding and students with deep financial needs, and Falls Church is a relatively prosperous jurisdiction, so we're not eligible for many of those funds. We have then the carry forward, which I will note is a pretty solid number this year relative to historical trends, but it's going down, and it will not be there next year. So we always say next year is going to be a difficult budget year, even compared to this year. In the absence of the carry forward, that's not going to be available to make up for tax revenues next year. And then federal funding, as I mentioned, is 1.1%. Why is the state funding so low? Well, that's because of the LCI, which is an index, a formula that takes into account real estate values, property values, income, and what's the third, Mr. Giebel? Sales tax. And adjusted gross income. There's an index and a formula that basically tops out at 0.8, which is the higher you go, the less revenue you receive from the state. There are 8 jurisdictions now that hit that 0.8 threshold. Williamsburg just dropped off that. But basically what this means is even Fairfax County, for example, receives substantially more in state funding because they have a relatively lower LCI, even though they are a relatively prosperous jurisdiction. And come on, Fairfax County, get going there. Okay, there we go. As I mentioned, Fairfax County has an index of 0.68. If our index were at the Fairfax County level, we would receive an additional $1.8 million from the state. There is, from time to time, an effort to try to adjust the LCI so that it gets more equitable outcomes, but for now, this is something that we're living with. In Loudoun County, they have an index of 0.54. That would give us an additional $4.1 million in revenue from the state. Ultimately, the LCI is doubtless a problem for us. I would say, though, that when you talk to school board members and superintendents from other divisions who have a lower LCI, yes, they do get additional state aid, but they have tremendous challenges, and I'm not sure that that would be an exchange I would want to make. Our problems are problems of prosperity and of growth, and there are many other divisions in the Commonwealth where the problems are the exact opposite: declining enrollments, closing schools, high poverty, high need for free and reduced school lunches. So yes, this is a problem for us, but I would remind everyone that this may be a better problem to have than the opposite. So to sum up, on the fiscal year 2017 budgets, we have an operating budget of $48.6 million for teachers, maintenance, transportation, electricity, and other such costs. Community service is $2.1 million. That's for daycare, facility rentals, park and rec, use of buildings, and the BIE. The food service, which Mr. Kane does a great job of, is $1.09 million for breakfast and lunch. I would also point out here that we have about needs can go on and on, but we have concrete unfunded needs that basically are about $1.5 million for things such as additional professional staff, support staff, maintenance equipment, materials and supplies, professional development, which is a key initiative to keep our teachers growing professionally, and things such as furniture. These are not things that we are asking for in the sense that they be added to our budget this year, but this is to note that in the course of developing our budget, we have consciously excluded things that we would certainly like to ask for under better circumstances. And that's the end of my slideshow here. I would note that Mr. Sharp is here. Welcome, it's nice to see you, Kieran. Mr. Lawrence was here, but he has just stepped out. And so with that, I'll end my presentation, and we can field questions.
So we will pass the microphone if anybody would like to ask any questions or make any comments on the budget.
Good morning.
Good morning. I have a couple of questions. One, I saw, I think on the CIP, Wyatt, you had $105 million in there for the high school, and I'm just wondering why it's 105 and not 112.
The 105 reflects the number that we have had for many years for this project, and I think we do need to make that adjustment. Under the current thinking on the cost of the school, the construction program remains $105 million. What is now being added to that is furniture and equipment and fixtures, and that would be an additional $7 million for a cost of $112 million.
My other question, I guess, is for Dr. Jones and Justin about the school budget. I've been to all the budget work sessions for the last 2 years, and what I've been looking for is, and I've also been to the school board meetings, what I'm looking for is when you do the program review and dig into the details of the program, and I was really looking for that in the budget process. So while I see your slides, what I'm concerned about is sort of what's not there. And what I mean specifically is your planning factors. I noticed at the most recent round of meetings, no one on the board asked any questions about specifically when Dr. Jones spoke about, for example, our ESOL program. She said that everything was great in that regard, and if you go to the VDOE website, that's a very dire situation with regard to pass rates. So I'm just curious that there was not only that there's no questions, but how can you rely on the planning factors when we have a principal from the high school asking for more staff? So that speaks to an issue like maybe those planning factors aren't really valid. And then if you look at the test scores that we get for the amount of teachers that you are proposing for this group of students, the fail rate's pretty high. And the same with special ed. I also waiting for that program review. Nothing in that regard. And we have huge portions of special education students failing their SOLs. I think I saw a pass rate, one number, 67%. I mean, you can do the math and figure out what the fail rate is. So I'm just concerned about your planning factors and the fact that there is no program reviews for the community to understand that those numbers, are really reflective of the needs. And so I was wondering if you could speak to the planning factors and why a principal request is ignored and things like that.
Our planning factors are reviewed every year, and we actually had what I thought was a really good chart that was new for us this year that compared what is required in the state of Virginia to what we actually have. And we feel as though we are staffed well. We do work with our staff on those staffing numbers. We are very comparable to, for instance, what you would see in Arlington, which is another high-achieving school division. Quite frankly, as a school superintendent, I feel incredibly lucky to be able to have the planning factors that we do. In essence of our test results, I'm going to counter that a little bit and be an advocate for our children and for our teachers, because I think they do tremendous, tremendous work. And we talk about our programmatic issues all year long, not just during the budget. And I do believe that our ESOL students are doing extremely well. We don't look at the SOL as the way to measure a child and whether they are growing, and we are teaching in a way that we're getting maximum growth. Unfortunately, in the United States, our children are taking tests that are often highly inappropriate for them to be taking. When a child moves here and they are 10 years old, and they have never been in school. We have children actually that are 16 that have come from countries where they have never been, not only in school in their own country, they have never been in a school, and they do not speak English. And so our teachers use what's called the WIDA, and the school board has dug into this very deeply. So they do understand that we're looking at the components of reading, writing, speaking, and listening first. And that's where we look. Are our children growing in their English literacy skills? Because you cannot read before you have basic literacy skills. And our children have been phenomenal in that area. And one of the reasons that we actually will show, in some regards, even lower on the SOL is because our children that are with us over time actually test out, and they're no longer counted as ESOL students. So we don't actually look at the SOL. We drill we pay attention to it, but we drill farther down than that because our kids are getting great results. Same way with special education. We do, again, have children taking inappropriate tests. And I would stand before the community and back the work of our special education teachers. Our special education results are the highest in the state. And that's because our teachers do a phenomenal job. So, I don't know if I left anything out, Mr. Castillo.
Well, I would just say that one of the things about the budget is that we are developing a budget for a group of students that we don't know who they are. So I don't think it's possible to say, we know who we're going to be teaching in fiscal year 16 and 17, and so this is what we plan to do. We develop budgets, we develop priorities, and then as Dr. Jones says, we adjust to meet the specific needs of those students down the road. So I think you have to bear in mind what the budget process is, what the timeline is, and also remember that as needs change, we make changes programmatically to address those. The budget asks are developed by the principals for their buildings, and they come to us. If there are additional needs, those principals should and will make those known. And of course, we will meet the needs of all of our students. Yes, we don't know who we're going to be teaching in fiscal year 16 and 17, but I am confident that when those students show up, whenever they show up at the beginning of the year, in the middle of the year, we will make all appropriate steps to ensure that they are educated to the best of our ability within our budget constraints and to meet the specific needs for those students. One of the things that I'm very hopeful for as we go forward is that we developed the ability, and you see this in math in elementary school, in the offerings in the high school, is that we present programs and courses and offerings that allow every student to meet his or her potential. And I think that ultimately is something that makes Falls Church unique. I think that's the level of individual attention that we're still able to provide, as maybe we're not a small school division anymore, but we're certainly a smaller school division because Arlington has 10 times the number of students that we do. And Fairfax County has almost, the student population of Fairfax County is 180,000+ students, which is, 12 to 15 times the population of Falls Church City. We're a smaller jurisdiction. We pay attention to the needs of all of our students, and we do, I think, a very good job. We're not perfect. If we had the ability to spend as much as a private school would, at $30,000 a student, could we do better? I'm sure we could, but I think we have tremendously dedicated professionals and administrators, and we work very hard to meet the needs of all students. So I reject the notion that test score results dictate what success or failure. I think that mentality has been one of the things that's been one of the great banes of our public education system over the past decade plus. And I would again say that we do an excellent job.
Well, if I could just follow up, I know that we use, when, we have a very high pass rate overall for our district. I know that we use those SOL scores to say that we do well. So if we're not, either we're using them or we're not. And I just was concerned about, would just like to see in the budget process moving forward to have more discussion tied to outcomes, in that process, where I know you're now saying that the numbers you have are for students we haven't met, it's for the future, but in the trenches when you're in that budget process, you could bring up, the data for the year before to assess those programs. It's just something that I'd like to see, just that data.
You may not know, but in the summertime, we do programmatic analysis because the school year being what it is, you don't know what some of these test scores are until they're processed and delivered in the summer. So to say we should be looking at the budget process, I think would be way too late. We look at that much earlier in the year to understand what the needs are to build into the budget going forward. So we have a cycle. The cycle is develop the budget, start the school year, evaluate how the year went, and then repeat the cycle, develop needs and priorities, and put those into the next budget. We cannot do, as I said, we don't know who we're going to be teaching, so programmatically with our budget, we allocate resources, and then once the school year starts, we make our adjustments. So we do those programmatic analyses. I'm not sure whether you were at those meetings in the summertime, but in fact we have and we do. And I think to suggest otherwise would be misleading. I know you didn't do that, Ms. Kuchma. But we do programmatic analysis, and we are constantly watching how things are going, and again, asking the superintendent, are the building principals getting what they need? And if not, what can we do to adjust? And that is happening.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Mr. Snyder in the back?
Thanks very much. I wanted to not comment on what we've heard so far, but put a couple things on the record with regard to transportation funding. And it's part and parcel of what we're seeing, a devolution to local governments by the federal and state government, where the mandates increase but the funding decreases. And that's having a particularly severe impact on Falls Church and is getting more and more aggravated. We've heard documented the local composite index, where if we had the same index as Fairfax County, our tax rate could be 6 cents lower. Same tax rate as Loudoun County, our tax rate could be 10 cents lower. In the transportation area, that was one area where Northern Virginia, by and large, got close, never adequate, but close to what we needed. What we're seeing here are some dramatic negative trends, and I want to illustrate both of those. And we're already seeing it show up in our budget. The first is the failure to have a floor on the gas tax means that Northern Virginia Transportation Commission jurisdictions, including this one, are going to increasingly have to pay in to support transit. So the effect of not maintaining a floor on the gas tax means a shift from gas tax to local government taxing sources, which are largely homeowners and our local businesses. So ironically, what in the House of Delegates was argued as preventing a tax increase actually is a tax increase on our citizens, and we're not collecting the taxes that would be paid by people passing through and buying gas in our area. So the impact of that is already starting to show in our budget. And I would say that the Senate moved legislation to reestablish a floor and to provide for increased funding, and the House of Delegates rejected it in a totally irresponsible action. But and this Thursday, the head of the Department of Rail and Public Transit for the state of Virginia also illustrated another, as if that issue isn't bad enough, another problem. Starting in fiscal year 2016, transit capital funding will decline by 62%. The effect of that, again, will impose on local jurisdictions greater obligation to support capital, things like Metro, VRE, and other transit sources. Again, a case where the feds have not done their job and the state legislature so far has not stepped up. I did lobby both issues, but I'm raising both of these to provide further examples of where the state and federal government are increasingly, and I think abusively, passing on costs to localities, which more and more will show up in our budget and are starting to show up. So I wanted to present these. I'll be talking about it at future meetings. But the one was bad enough, the failure to have the floor, and now we're facing what's called a fiscal cliff, which will dramatically, again, run the risk of shifting even more costs of what should be state-funded projects to localities. I just wanted to make those points and put them on the record this morning. Any questions from anyone here? Thank you.
And Mr. Snyder's worked very hard to help the city access transportation funds that the city is eligible for. And one of the successes I think we have had is, if you look on the capital improvement side, through the NVTA process, we have really gotten significant funds for capital projects. The bad news, however, is for WMATA funding. The federal government is pulling back from its support for WMATA. The gas tax revenues, which are key for funding WMATA, are decreasing, which we've all seen at the pump. So what that means in numbers in this budget is $417,000 of local money going to fund WMATA, which didn't used to be in the budget. And of that amount, about $240,000 is absorbed in the general government budget, and then we ask for the personal property tax increase to fund the remainder to generate new revenues for that. But it's a significant increase to requiring new local funds to meet those obligations. Tina.
I was going to ask if there was going to be any change in the future with WMATA, or what we're seeing for trends is what it is, and next year it will be at least that bad, if not more.
Well, if
especially if there's no floor on the tax,
right,
on the gas tax.
It depends on partly what happens with gas tax prices. So our gas tax is a percentage of what you pay at the pump, and so if the price goes up, that the actual real dollar amounts that you pay at the pump go up as well. So that could, gas prices are at historic lows right now, so that could increase in the future. Now, taxpayers are going to pay that one way or the other, but in terms of the city's budget, that could be an improvement. However, given WMATA's cost profile, I think it's reasonable to expect that our local contribution to WMATA is going to continue to be a big issue for us in budgets going forward. And the federal and the state's willingness to help on that seems to be very limited. Now, we can try to improve that situation through lobbying, and we do a lot of that, but the signs aren't positive right now for the reasons that Mr. Snyder mentioned.
Mayor, would you like to talk? Do you have a question about your budget? Mr. Sharp. Commercial overlay, right?
The risk of going outside the educational field for a minute. And following up on Mr. Snyder's comments, the counties around us have a very different tax structure in the way that they support transportation funding. They impose, each of the counties, a minimum of 12.5 cents above the regular tax rate on every commercial property to fund transportation. And then there are individual business districts within each of those counties that have surtaxes that are even higher than that. There was an example that I provided to the council some time ago showing that in the rail corridor going out to Dulles, there's roughly 20 cents further beyond the base tax and the base commercial surtax of 20 cents, and that one of the tax bills of a property in that area showed a tax rate of $1.48. And so our tax structure could be very different. I think it probably would take startup in terms of administering such a tax that may be a wash for the first year or so in trying to adjust our tax structure to be something like what the counties do. But I hope that our citizens will appreciate that that our structure is very different, and that in some ways, because it's different, we can perhaps encourage more commercial development here by showing, say, the difference between our tax rate on commercial property that is fairly near to metro stops versus tax rates near metro stops in the Tysons area, which are very much at an increase above what we charge our commercial property, and it should be a very attractive situation for commercial businesses looking for new places to locate.
Thank you, Mr. Sharp, and we call this the Kieran Sharp slide now, and I think I think it's a very good illustration. Tysons we just use as one example, but you have the Route 28 corridor, you have many different special tax districts. In McLean, there's the McLean Community Center tax district. In Herndon, there's a special tax district for their community center. So there are all of these permutations. It's a complex tapestry of taxes. This is one, I think, fairly clear illustration, though. And we do, as we're marketing the city for commercial development, this is part of our pitch. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. If there are no other questions, thank you for coming out on a cold and wintry spring day, and look forward to the next public hearing again on Monday night. And the council will be working hard between now and April 25th when final consideration of all these issues will be on the agenda. Thank you again.